That day it snowed nonstop this winter. It has been especially icy. Her hands and feet were always cold, which is why she had a morbid aversion to the cold. Paying the bills cost a fortune, and the damn frosts made the price even higher. The girl understood that if everything continued like this, she could simply freeze to death. Deciding that people only live once, she agreed to pay for a drop of comfort. To avoid turning into an icicle, she decided to crank up the heating. And in that moment, someone lives like they're in paradise, without worrying at all about problems. The possessed Archduke of the North was the protagonist of a romantic fantasy story. The Archduke of the South, bright as a ray of sunshine, was also an important character. The comic she was reading was quite naive, and yet it was her only comfort. She stopped at the place where, for the first time, the Southern Archduke's gaze didn't shine with kindness. At that moment, the room became too cold, and she could get seriously ill due to the terrible draft. The girl decided to close the window, realizing it had been slightly open all this time. Taking a step, she slipped accidentally, unable to stay on her feet. The Southern Archduke was her favorite character, but she never got to finish the story. While falling, the girl thought that she would die right then and there, and that no one would help her. Just a second ago, she was terribly cold, but suddenly the cold was replaced by a warm room. And when she opened her eyes, there was a lot of light around her and a spacious room. And expensive. The Archduke of the North was very excited and asked how his beloved wife was feeling. The luxurious decorations surrounding her on all sides seemed to call to mind the events of that very romantic story. She immediately wanted to look in the mirror to see what she had become after falling out the window. Upon seeing her reflection, she realized she had died in an accident and had moved into the body of the comic's heroine. But the main character didn't have hair as white as snow, which means she was in another body. There was no heroine with a similar appearance in the comics, so who did she become? And this man who called her his wife must be with another girl. She thought, trying to understand who she would have to be in her new life. This young man was obviously very close to the true owner of the body. The girl asked him to explain why he called her his wife and why he was coming into her room. Michael suggested calling her simply Aisha if she felt more comfortable being addressed that way. Upon hearing this, she realized she had become nothing less than the ex-wife of the Archduke of the North. In the original story, this girl betrayed the Archduke and stole a lot of money from him. And then she fled to another country. Michael was willing to do anything for her, but Aisha broke his heart. And after that, he lost faith in women. Looking at his wife, Michael couldn't understand why she was so pale today. She was white as a corpse, and her whole body seemed frozen from the cold. Feeling the unbearable cold, he realized that this was becoming too dangerous. Taking her in his arms, Michael begged her to explain what had happened to her in just one day. The fire in the fireplace heated the whole house, but even that didn't help improve her well-being. From the outside, it seemed like the girl might give up the ghost, and these would be her last words. Suddenly, Aisha announced that she wanted to take a trip to the south of the empire as soon as possible. Despite his 26 years, the Archduke of the North was a magnificent commander-in-chief. He commanded a huge army and was considered one of the best generals in the country. You could say this man was an impeccable man, just as a protagonist should be. He almost never left his domains and asked her why she wanted to go to the south. Aisha replied that it was just a slight delirium and that she hadn't said at all what she wanted. If you think about it, there was another main character in the comic, and she was supposed to become his wife. Mabel, as the girl was called, lost her parents and arrived at the palace as a servant. The Empress accepted her into the family because she looked a lot like the late princess. All the servants who worked in the house sincerely loved Mabel and happily accepted her into their big family. Then, the charming Mabel met two main characters, the first of whom was Michael. Shortly after, she met the Southern Archduke named Davin, who fell head over heels for her. Aisha knew she had to get out of the house as quickly as possible before ruining the original plan. Looking at her, the young man decided to remind her of something before she said a word. He vowed never to let her go to the south, because the wife of the Archduke of the North must remain in the north. It's hard to understand why he is so obsessed with his north and won't let his wife travel. Michael was convinced that the Archduchess shouldn't abandon her own people. Upon seeing a new guest, he asked for the visitor to be received without leaving them unattended. It was the family doctor, Stuart, who came to check Aisha's condition. Approaching, he wanted to take the Archduchess's pulse, making sure everything was in order. The doctor still didn't say anything about her health, which made Aisha a little nervous. Michael demanded that he take his hands off his wife when he saw him begin the examination. He wanted to get an answer to the question of why Aisha loses consciousness so often, and what causes the illness. The doctor still didn't know where the girl was from, but it was very important. The answer to this question would help clarify how to start the healing process for the illness. All the courtiers already knew that the girl was from Malta, located in the south. This territory belonged to the same southern archduke she was supposed to meet. All the aristocracy lives there, and Aisha began to assume that she was also of noble origin. Upon hearing this, the doctor suddenly declared that he knew exactly the cause of the strange illness. A southerner's body doesn't tolerate the low temperatures of the far north well. She cannot bear the cold, which is why she often faints and feels dizzy. The doctor recommended spending as much time as possible near a warm fireplace. However, in the future, combustion products could cause even more damage to her fragile health. After thinking about the problem, Aisha suggested prescribing treatment at a sanatorium. Stuart happily supported the idea and suggested that they go to a sanatorium located in the south. Upon hearing the words about the south, Michael advised him not to continue the sentence if he didn't want trouble. After apologizing for his stupidity, the doctor abruptly changed his mind, suggesting that they not leave the place. Demanding the exam be completed, Michael thanked the doctor for the work done. His wife collapsed before his eyes, and Michael didn't even think about truly solving the problem. He acted as stubbornly as if he hadn't wanted to treat her from the beginning. In the original story, when she and Mabel were together, the girl was delighted with life in the north. Kissing her hand gently, he asked her never to return to the southern regions. But for some reason, the author didn't end their story on a happy note. With horror, Aisha realized that this could be karma, and that she would have to deal with it herself. Seeing his wife's strange behavior, the Archduke asked her why she was pulling her hair. Aisha didn't understand why she couldn't go to the south, since her homeland was there. She was curious to know what answer he would give this time, and how he would justify his decision. Michael said he wasn't going to let his wife go to the place where a dirty man lived. This unpleasant guy was well known to him, and he knew that Aisha knew his name. He advised being careful with that bastard named Davin. Otherwise, it would lead to big problems. She had no idea before that in the original story, Aisha was friends with that man. This character was the very embodiment of good nature that always lit up the world with a sunny smile. Probably, Michael didn't want to let him set foot on his territory and have relationships with his wife. Turning around, he began to pretend he was an offended husband. For the next 4 days, he decided not to talk to Aisha, which caused her to feel guilty. The maid was constantly worried about her mistress, asking if everything was okay with her health. Smiling in response, she asked her not to worry about anything, assuring her that everything was fine with her. This sweet maid hadn't left her side from the moment Aisha woke up after losing consciousness. The unbearable cold of the north became more intense every day, and she slept like a log. 4 days spent in a new body were enough to understand a simple truth. Like it or not, now she will have to live in this body for the rest of her life. Lara managed to notice how the Duke went out on patrol with the knights and returned only late at night. Today would be the perfect day to run away from home, just as she had planned to do. The maid burst into the room and shouted important news. A gut feeling told me that she had come running here with bad news. It turned out that an unexpected guest had arrived at the estate, and the butler escorted him to the living room. Someone managed to reach the estate despite the unbearable cold. 10 minutes later, all the servants greeted that same southern archduke. In the past, he was an ordinary young prince, but now he has become a quite influential person. And there he was, sitting in front of her, slowly drinking an expensive brand of tea. Looking at the young woman, Davin greeted her in his usual way. He looked much more masculine than she had imagined when she read the comic. He had some business nearby, and while returning, decided to stop by to visit. For someone relegated to a secondary role, such a visit was too great an honor. The young man regretted not having managed to catch the owner of the estate. However, he was very happy that his young wife still took the time to spend time with him. Aisha asked to tell her a little about how his family is doing now. Judging by his reaction, the family really did exist, and she hadn't been wrong with the question. Up close, he looked exactly as she had imagined, and in some respects even better. Davin admitted he didn't expect the question about his family's life. He spoke of it as if the original heroine had a bad relationship with her relatives. He was about to discuss something since she had asked that question. From the conversation, she realized that she was indeed an aristocrat in the Baron's family. Aisha knew very little about her father to try to figure out what kind of man he was. They say he couldn't control himself and constantly visited gambling establishments. Davin knew that all of her father's debts were paid by the Archduke when he married Aisha. Upon hearing these words, she realized that her own father had sold her to solve his debt problems. The young man sent Arian to an academy on the outskirts of the empire and asked for them not to worry about him. He was her younger brother, so she couldn't abandon him to his fate. After thanking him for looking after her brother, she promised to repay him with the same kindness. Davin was sure they weren't strangers to each other and should show friendly feelings. Thinking about his words, the girl realized that at that moment, they were just friends. Now he intended to talk about something more important if she didn't object. Coming a little closer to her, the young man asked her if she knew why he had come. Since he was too close, she even closed her eyes with emotion. In his hand, he had the same document that Aisha herself had asked him to bring. 2 months ago, on the day of the wedding, she secretly asked for the divorce agreement to be brought to her. Davin himself was a little surprised, because she started thinking about divorcing her husband right on the wedding day. The girl pretended she had completely forgotten about it and thanked him again for his help. The young man tried to reassure her, telling her that they wouldn't be able to catch her after she had escaped to the south. He was willing to personally deal with the Baron if he tried to interfere. However, looking him straight in the eyes, she admitted that she didn't want to hurt her husband's feelings. Suddenly, she changed her mind and declared that they first had to reach the capital. Still not understanding her thoughts, Davin asked her to make sure to contact him if anything happened. She decided to leave her home as quickly as possible before the terrible Archduke of the North returned. This frost even ruined her mood, so she wanted to return home. Now, after talking to this character, she began to feel the reality of what was happening. A couple of days later, Aisha decided to carry out the escape plan she had prepared in advance. Her things were already packed, and she had memorized the map of the area. Of course, she didn't forget to leave an apology letter where she described her intolerance to the cold. It was a bit strange that everything went so easily, and she managed to avoid running into the nights. Running toward the dock, she realized that the last ship was there, preparing to set sail. Just before boarding, the girl didn't even notice the knight who was behind her. With a threatening look, the boy ordered them to follow him back to the estate. So the first escape attempt failed, and she found herself back at home. After carefully examining the room, she began to realize that nothing had changed at all. Deciding that she had a chance to repeat it, she decided to make a second attempt. The guard change was expected soon. There would be very little time, but it should be enough. A second later, she quickly closed the room door, fearful of a second consecutive failure. For a while, the girl remained motionless in the middle of the room, trying to decide what to do next. An hour later, the maids encountered a small kitten that had managed to enter the house. One of them decided that it had crawled through an unsealed hole in the wall. After listening to their conversation, Aisha wanted to see that place herself. After the first attempt, she managed to enter the hole, and this was her last chance to escape. However, instead of a saving exit, she suddenly saw a strange stranger before her eyes. For a while, she couldn't say a word and just looked him in the eyes with horror. After the second failed attempt, she had to endure the threatening gaze of her husband. Grabbing her hand tightly, Michael just wanted to ask her one thing. Without hiding his anger from the servants, he demanded to know why she was constantly trying to run away from home. Every day the maids assured me that it was only -20 degrees outside, and that it wasn't cold at all. After hearing a mountain of reproaches directed at her, for the first time she wanted to tell the whole truth. Michael, not wanting to hear anything, warned her that he would always bring her back. After these words, the girl declared aloud that she could no longer bear that cold. It seemed like her husband should have said at least something in response, but Aisha didn't hear anything. Looking her in the eyes, the Duke asked her if it was really just the cold. He ordered the servants to prepare hot tea and light all the fireplaces in the house. The maids promised the warmest night, because even Aisha's blanket was replaced with a new one. After a while, the girl was in a warm bed and actually felt warmer. Turning to her side, she suddenly realized that her husband had tied her hands with a strong bandage. The girl was surprised by this act, but couldn't do anything. Looking a little closer, she began to guess why he did it. When Michael opened his eyes, he decided to take off the bandage and not keep his wife in the room anymore. The young man snapped his fingers and signaled to the servants waiting outside. A moment later, Aisha had a cup of hot drink in her hands, prepared especially for her. The Duke explained that the cup contained a foreign medicine, and that it was extremely effective. However, in the girl's eyes, this medicine looked more like some kind of unpleasant substance. In addition to the medicine, the maids offered to bring a scarf and fox fur gloves from a famous artisan. They actively stoked the fireplace fire, trying to raise the temperature to the limit. Michael asked to wait a little longer, until it got very hot in the house. The girl turned abruptly towards him and declared that she felt very dizzy due to the heat. For a while, they looked at each other in silence, as if some misunderstanding had occurred. Breaking the oppressive silence, she asked for an explanation about the strange night bandage. Furthermore, Aisha still didn't understand at what point he managed to lie down in the bed with her. Realizing that she was a little hurt by such an act, the Duke couldn't say anything convincing. He recalled that he only followed the doctor's advice, who recommended holding her hand, and the bandage was necessary so as not to accidentally let go of my hand while sleeping. And that is the only reason. At that moment, the girl realized that the Duke had started calling her constantly only by her first name. He promised to ensure that the house was always warm, just so Aisha wouldn't try to run away. Curiously, upon hearing these words, the poor girl's heart fluttered with emotion. In a past life, Davin had already helped her escape from home, promising to take care of everything. It was as if he didn't understand how his prejudice could affect Aisha's life. However, the new story differs from the original, because Michael had long suspected a conspiracy. At that moment, the lady didn't leave her room for several days and refused to eat. Sitting in his office, Michael couldn't understand why his wife hated him so much. He remembered over and over her last words that she couldn't stand the cold of the north. The Duke hoped that, once the cold problem was solved, the girl would give up her attempts to escape. Previously, it seemed to him that she just wanted to leave and was looking for any excuse to break the relationship. All these thoughts made his head spin, as if he were starting to go crazy. A second later, Aisha appears by my side, demanding to know what is happening in that house. The young man decides to confess that last night, he conducted a small interrogation of the doctor. When asked how Aisha should be treated, he recommended giving her medicines that would warm her up every day. The answer was too standard and clearly didn't please the young man. However, he ordered him to return in a couple of days for a new examination of the patient. One wrong word could cost him his life if the doctor talks about a vacation in the south again. 2 days later, the doctor came to examine her and observed an improvement in her condition. He was sure that the bed rest and the excessively frequent intake of medications could be suspended. But there is an important rule that the doctor decided to warn us about before leaving. Looking severely at the newlyweds, he advised them to hold hands as often as possible. To achieve this, they will need to sleep in the same bed, without separating from each other, not even while they sleep. After hearing the advice of his family doctor, Michael asked to trust his experience. From that moment on, the Duke held her hand every day, carefully taking care of his wife. He skipped training under strange excuses, just to spend more time with Aisha. Even in his office, while performing his daily activities, he preferred to be accompanied. By observing his strange behavior, the girl little by little began to get used to her new life. At some point, she decided to wonder if this was really necessary for medical purposes. She felt a little embarrassed by the interested looks of all the inhabitants of the estate, including the servants. A young servant in particular stared at them from afar and acted in a too reserved manner. She decided that the boy felt ashamed of her because he was still very small. Listening to his wife, the Duke didn't let her go even during a simple conversation. Kissing her hand gently, he asked her if she felt warmer after all the changes in the house. His velvety voice embarrassed the young woman a little, who turned away shyly. Meanwhile, the South has always been famous for its wonderful weather and long sunny days. Due to the trip to the north, Davin had many things to do and a ton of unsigned documents. Looking at Baron, he apologized because he never got to see his older brother at the estate. The next time he was there, Davin promised to clear up this little misunderstanding. In response, Baron advised simply resting after long trips. Remembering Aisha, he seemed to recognize again this sweet and friendly girl. Never before had he seen her so alive, as if she really liked the north. In his distant childhood, when he saw her for the first time, she seemed very disheveled to him. Sitting at the common table, Aisha ate with such avidity that it seemed as if her family were starving her. In all the time they had known each other, He had never seen a smile on her beautiful face. At that moment, Davin couldn't take his eyes off her, trying to do it as discreetly as possible. One day, he decided to say something, asking to understand those words correctly. The young duke admitted that he had secretly brought a lot of bread there, noticing her constant hunger. At that moment, he realized that that meek girl was very different from all the others. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, she married the Archduke of the North. For a long time, the guests couldn't understand why the bride was so sad. But Davin's thoughts were occupied with something else. Having met her alone, he asked her to tell him why she insisted on that meeting. Suddenly, Aisha admitted that she wanted to divorce her husband and entrusted him with all the formalities. It wasn't an easy request, but since Aisha was a southerner, he was obliged to help. The Duke gathered all the necessary papers, and in 2 months, everything was prepared. He was constantly tormented by doubts, because when Aisha was free, she would no longer need help. Despite this, in their last conversation, the young woman said that she didn't want to hurt her husband's feelings. Lost in his thoughts, Dabin couldn't understand why she had changed her mind so abruptly. Meanwhile, Aisha was taking a hot bath, something especially pleasant when living in the north. After carefully examining her body, she suddenly noticed many bruises that she hadn't noticed before. Only once did she realize this, but she didn't dare to ask the maid unnecessary questions. At that moment, the maid announced that the young woman's dress was almost ready. After thanking Lara, she decided to investigate a little more about the matter before new abrasions appeared on her body. After a while, the personal maid offered several beautiful necklaces to choose from. With a smile on her face, she admitted that she wanted to see her mistress as the most beautiful. The expensive necklace with a pink gemstone matched her eyes very well. Lara had no doubt that this particular piece of jewelry would be the perfect choice. Before she could even put on the necklace, she noticed with horror something that Aisha simply couldn't know. It turned out that there was also a bruise on the nape of her neck, invisible under the thick hair. The maid begged her to forgive her, but she was sure that by then the bruise would heal. She felt terribly uncomfortable in this situation and promised to behave more carefully. Aisha stared in her direction and realized that this was an excellent opportunity to ask a question. After calming the frightened maid, she asked her not to worry about that triviality. In response, Lara again assured that next time she will be more careful when doing her hair. She behaved like a real child, since the Archduke ordered the servants to take care of the young woman. The next day it was still cold outside, but Aisha was improving little by little. The Duke couldn't understand why she had behaved so rudely since early in the morning. It turned out he had forced Aisha to wear several pairs of gloves at once, which had caused her anger. Without listening to the reproaches, he stopped her abruptly to give her an important order. Michael ordered the knight not to leave her side for even a moment while she was on the training field. Upon hearing the order, Chloe began to guess that her peaceful life had come to an end. With a smile on his face, the Duke advised me to keep being as energetic as I am. And he really likes that. With these words, he walked silently in the other direction, leaving the girl completely bewildered. Chloe decided to ask what happened that morning at the moment of their meeting. Aisha couldn't answer this question because her heart felt somewhat empty. She tried to push away the dark thoughts that constantly swarmed in her head. In response, she only asked for the hot tea that was there last time to be prepared for her. This cheerful guard plays an important role, being a person close to Michael. While suggesting a short walk, Aisha began to suspect something. Turning to one side, she noticed that the same boy was watching her next to the Duke. While greeting the Archduchess, the young man was ready to follow any order. In the original story, Aisha had a younger brother who was the same age as this boy. She immediately offered him a prize, hoping to become good friends in the future. Looking at Baron with a smile, the girl assured him that no one would find out about this. As usual, Chloe began to tell the same story that she had heard many times before. Instead, Aisha suggested drinking delicious tea, which is especially pleasant to drink in the north. Michael didn't give his wife permission to drink tea and demanded that she return to her tasks. Jumping quickly from her seat, Aisha assured that she herself had asked to organize a small tea party. She had to explain to him that Baron was simply passing through, and she decided to invite him to have some cookies. Chloe warned with a smile that the knight was only joking, and that he had been close to that young man for a long time. They had known each other for a long time. You could say that Baron grew up on this estate. Upon hearing these words, the girl couldn't understand why Michael behaved so rudely, even with his loved ones. At that moment, a loud voice was heard in the room, and the butler asked to take a short break. Even before she had time to hear his words, a bad feeling gripped her heart. She understood that today they would meet a person they would want to forget forever. Determined to support her, the Duke reminded her that Aisha shouldn't blame herself for what happened. Upon entering the house, the Baron cheerfully greeted the owner and his young wife. The journey here turned out to be difficult, so Ernest apologized for being late. In response, Michael abruptly rejected the hospitality, deciding it would be better to talk right there. He didn't want him to leave a trace in the living room, so he suggested getting straight to the point. This treatment raised many questions, as if the Duke were about to leave him to his fate. Never before had the servant seen the master treat guests with such rudeness. Upon realizing that he was not welcome there, the Baron asked his son-in-law to lend him some money. Michael was very angry. It could be easily seen with the naked eye. Before giving his answer, he decided to consult with Aisha about her father's request. Usually, a loving father would act differently, but the girl didn't want to reject her own father. A second later, instead of helping, the Duke decides to act differently, giving orders to his knights. Upon realizing that they wanted to throw him out of the house, Ernest began to demand an explanation at the top of his lungs. Michael advised him to behave with a little more modesty while he was in someone else's house. He ordered the guards to capture the old grump and introduce him to the cold of the north. For the first time, Aisha realized that there wasn't a hint of nobility in this man. He continued to bombard everyone with vile insults, forgetting that his own daughter was nearby. Upon learning something about the agreement between the Baron and the Duke, the young man hastened to turn to Aisha. There was too much of a draft in that place, and he suggested going elsewhere. Having offered to follow him, the Duke turned sharply in the opposite direction. After the Baron's visit, there were even more questions and many thoughts in my head. She wondered if she should stay in the north and continue living Aisha's life. Having calmed down a little, the young man was glad he had been able to contain his emotions. But Aisha didn't understand why he treated a man who had simply lent him money so rudely. If the true owner of the body returns, she will never have time to resolve everything. Michael was a little agitated and asked not to think too much about the incident. In response, the girl stated that she wanted to fix everything and that it was a personal matter. Soon, while walking down the hall, she accidentally saw a document that had fallen from his hands. This document belonged to a servant who was in too much of a hurry to reach the Duke's office. Looking at the young man, she realized that he simply didn't have time for delays. In his hands, there was a report on the latest expenses of the duchy, and one could know Michael's purchases. Curiously, in the official report, it appeared that the expense was linked to her father's name. A few minutes later, Aisha demanded to know what that expense meant. Looking him straight in the eyes, she wanted to hear the whole truth to the very last word. The Duke had to tell about the agreement that had been drafted shortly before the wedding. Listening carefully to his excuses, the girl couldn't remember anything like the original story. Michael didn't want to hide the fact that later another important clause was added to the contract. According to this clause, the Duke is obliged to provide the Baron with a certain sum of money. The young man explained this by saying that she was previously called Aisha Marion and was not his wife. That's why he agreed to give money, because he didn't want to leave his future wife's family in trouble. After hearing the strange story, she admitted that she couldn't even be truly angry at him. The girl decided to ask for something, hoping for understanding from her husband. She wanted to see her father again if the Duke agreed to bring him back to the house. Having accepted to fulfill the request, Michael decided not to leave her alone with the Baron. He was glad that her father had arrived much faster than expected. Finally, the girl warned that in such a situation the father could ask for too much money. At that moment, the girl heard a loud male voice belonging to Baron Ernest. The old man was already there, calling his own daughter an ungrateful child. Ignoring the insults, she decided to talk about something. Instead of calm communication, he started throwing accusations because they dragged him like a sack of potatoes. He started behaving too loudly, as if he had forgotten with whom he had the honor of speaking. Looking at this man, Aisha decided to abandon the family of her own free will. She only asked to sign a document that would forever change her previous surname. Upon hearing this statement, the Baron realized with horror that he would now be left without the Duke's financial support. The real Aisha wouldn't have dared even to look him in the eyes and would have resigned herself to any fate. The Baron decided to warn her that her actions would damage the entire Marion family. He reminded her that the Duke could abandon her, and then the girl would have nowhere to go. Unable to contain his emotions, Michael demanded that he be careful with his words. He didn't want his wife to take all that nonsense seriously and do what she planned. Looking this scoundrel in the eyes, Aisha reminded him that she herself makes those decisions. Even if in the future she ends up on the street, this will not affect her decision to leave the family. Only now did the Baron finally realize that he could lose his own daughter forever. Throughout this time, the guards kept their eyes open, ready to be nearby at any moment. The girl looked at her father with fury and advised him not to test her patience, and that he just sign. The document was completely ready, only a small signature was missing. Having received what she wanted, Aisha asked him not to appear at the Archduke's house again. Begging for a stop, the Baron asked for the last time not to leave the family in poverty. However, Aisha had no intention of taking the documents to court at this time. The man continued to insist that she would never stop being part of the Marian family. And yet the document was signed, and now those words had no meaning. Remembering what happened, she wondered how the true owner of the body would have acted in her place. But then the girl realized that there was no point in getting angry about what she had already done. Approaching Chloe, she thanked the knight with a smile for his faithful service. Chloe still couldn't believe that the young woman would really abandon her family. In fact, she had no intention of disowning her family. She just needed leverage over her father. She asked not to worry about this. These papers would serve her well. Gently hugging his wife, the Duke asked her to leave all other matters related to the documents to him. At that moment, he remembered that another innocent victim could be left in peace. We are talking about her younger brother, who will remain under her father's influence for a long time. Michael offered to bring her brother to the estate, far from this unfortunate family. With these words, he himself wanted to take responsibility for her younger brother's life. After thinking for a moment, she reminded him that Davin was taking care of him at that moment. Upon hearing the name of the Southern Archduke, the young man turned sharply in the opposite direction. The plot hasn't really started yet, so they shouldn't meet before that moment. Michael hadn't liked this friendly duke for a long time, as if there were some kind of enmity between them. The girl decided to remind him that the first thing he had to do was return the 2,000 gold coins. This money went directly to the Baron's estate and easily covered all the household maintenance expenses. The Baron didn't know yet that the Duke had already taken care of his financial problems in advance. Aisha was sure that her father's visit today had also been of great benefit. The young man hoped that after such a gift, he would no longer bother anyone. He suggested they go out to get some fresh air, since Aisha hadn't had time to go for a walk either. Despite the cold, a new feeling was born in her soul and the desire to accept the invitation. Upon hearing the conversation, Chloe asked him to take her with him if they decided to go for a walk. With a smile on his face, he agreed to take the guard with her, since that was his main duty. Little by little, the information that the husband and wife don't get along will be scattered by the wind. The girl herself didn't realize how she started getting more and more used to life in a new body. As usual, it was very cold outside, but Michael's care warmed her heart. Realizing that this wouldn't work, she asked her husband for a small favor. If he holds her hand, Aisha simply won't be able to finish her letter. Speaking kindly to Michael, she assured him that she wouldn't make a third attempt to escape. Suddenly, he started acting like an offended child, suggesting not to write the letter. Judging by his appearance, he definitely felt offended by this strange communication with the Southern Archduke. It was hard to understand why he hated Davin so much, who had always been a very kind person. Looking more closely at her husband, Aisha asked him to explain what their dispute was about. It turned out that the Duke was simply irritated by the expression on his face with which he communicated with those around him. As soon as he imagined Davin's face, it became unbearably suffocating. Although there was another detail he hadn't dared to talk about so openly before. The girl asked him not to continue. Otherwise, he would become sad and irritable again. Suddenly, the young man stated that she had been too close to Duke Davin, so much so that they started writing letters to each other much more frequently than between normal friends. The aristocrats of the North and South often invite each other, but they do so only out of courtesy. Usually, invitation letters are not even read to the end, and servants are asked to write a standard response. Now, after seeing the invitation letter from the North, Baron informed his lord about it. The young man was sure that this was simply another invitation letter that should be thrown in the trash. But this time, for some reason, Davin insisted on the opposite and asked him to deliver the letter to him. Without understanding the reason, Baron asked for an explanation of what that sudden interest was due to. Looking at the Archduke's face, he began to guess who that letter came from. After reading the letter to the end, Davin asked how many days were left until the flower festival. He was very surprised to learn that this holiday was 2 months away. Meanwhile, Aisha was almost ready to leave the confines of her property for the first time. The maids were happy to see her like this, hoping that this debut would be a success. They were sure that everyone around her would admire the Archduchess's beauty. Having finished her preparations, Aisha asked to be brought the robe with which she was going to go out into the world. Upon hearing this, the Duke suggested putting on a fur hat, remembering her intolerance to the cold. The maids were also a little surprised, because Aisha seemed to have forgotten about her illness. She understood that the meaning of nice clothes would be completely lost if you wrapped yourself in warm things. With time, the girl really got too used to the local climate. Having convinced her of the need to dress warmer, Michael prepared to take that long-awaited step. Although they were only going to the festival, everything was prepared to perfection. Looking at her husband with a smile, she asked him to explain why such an entourage was necessary. In response, the young man remembered that on the days when these types of events occur, the streets are filled with people. He acted quite strangely, as if he didn't realize that they would stand out too much. The Duke had thought of all eventualities, hoping to remember their first outing together. He decided to remind her that he once almost lost her when Aisha tried to run away from home. After these words, he decided to go first before the conversation took a wrong turn. Quickly reaching her near the carriage, the young man gallantly offered her his help. Looking her straight in the eyes, the Duke asked her in a low voice never to abandon her husband again. It seems it could be called karma if the girl keeps returning every time. Standing near the carriage, they looked at each other in silence for a while. On the way to the festival, Aisha decided to ask what was interesting about the event. The Duke began to talk about how at night there you could see the northern lights. She had never seen anything like it before and was a little excited about the upcoming event. She was ready to see something special that she would remember for the rest of her life. After a while, the young people arrived at the place. Everything was exactly as the Duke said. It seemed as if she were the only person who felt so cold outside. It was freezing cold outside, but only Aisha felt the severity of the climate. Everyone else spoke calmly about their own affairs, without even worrying about wearing warm clothes. A strange statue, erected especially for the day of the festival, caught her attention. The atmosphere was so cozy that it seemed as if the guests had known each other for a lifetime. At that moment, Aisha noticed something special in the distance, noticing it just now. Surprisingly, the flower was growing right on the road, and it was terribly cold outside. While the others continued to talk about various topics, the girl became interested in this flower. Looking at it from afar, she couldn't understand the name of that little miracle of nature. Suddenly, she perceived an aroma emanating that was different from the other smells. Feeling someone's hand on her, she heard a familiar male voice. Turning abruptly to one side, the girl again saw Michael's face in front of her. Instead of a welcoming smile, the young man's face expressed concern. Aisha hastened to explain that she simply saw a beautiful flower and decided to look at it more closely. This flower grew only in the north and had incredible resistance to frost. Chloe arrived just in time, hoping not to have missed the fun. She was almost sure that the Duke wouldn't scold her for being late to such a happy day. However, the Duke was not in the mood to grant indulgences to his knights. Now that Chloe was there, he decided to take a short walk and look around. Upon arriving at the main square, the Duke explained that people only gather there on important holidays. After several hours of walking, he continued to talk about the same thing. There was nothing officially planned, although Michael was expecting a big show. Upon hearing a loud male voice, both turned sharply towards the main stage. Every year, a young man assumes the position of festival host, and this year's festival was no exception. Noticing familiar faces in the crowd, he suddenly turned towards the two famous guests. It was a big surprise for Aisha to find herself in the center of attention. The crowd seemed to separate deliberately in different directions as the presenter announced the Duke's achievements. Michael warned that he didn't like any of that and didn't want to be seen. Realizing that this debut was very important, the girl decided to give her warm clothing to the maid. Despite the cold of the north, she wanted to look great in the eyes of her guests. In any case, Aisha hoped that this festival wouldn't last too long. In a matter of seconds, her whole body was covered in unbearable frost. Although lately it had been quite hot, the northerners endured such temperatures without problems, and the presenter didn't stop entertaining the audience. Only Aisha understood that that reckless act could cause a cold. Addressing the crowd, the Duke declared complete safety for all festival participants. After his speech, it was Aisha's turn, but the girl could barely say a word. Kissing her hand tenderly, he asked her not to worry if she wasn't ready to go out in public. However, looking at her confident partner, she understood that the Duke would support her in any situation. There is no need to be afraid of making mistakes when you have that support nearby. Suddenly, the girl felt much better and experienced a surge of new strength. Thanking him for his attention, she expressed her wish that this day be remembered by all the guests at the festival. While she spoke, she already foresaw that she would return shivering from hypothermia. Immediately after the difficult test, the girl decided to replenish a bit of her lost strength. Looking at her, the Duke realized that his wife's appetite improved a lot in the open air. Baron said that he had already tried this type of street food when he lived in the capital of the empire. Previously, she had no idea that this young servant also came from the capital. She was sure that he was a native of the north, judging by the ease with which he endured the cold. Turning towards her, the Duke asked her to explain the reason for such interest in Baron. They communicated with such interest, as if they had known each other for many years. After apologizing to the young man, Aisha offered him to choose any dish he wanted. Suddenly, Baron hurried away, which was strange, because the girl didn't say anything like that. Finding himself nearby, Michael decided to remind them that the festival hadn't ended yet. The main event he spoke about on the way is just beginning now. Shortly after, Aisha saw the northern lights for the first time in her life. It was incredibly beautiful, although the others didn't even look at the sky. Apparently, the local inhabitants have long since grown accustomed to this beauty and have stopped paying attention to it. Over time, she could also get used to it, but at that moment, she didn't want to take her eyes off it. Having brought a warm hat, the Duke didn't want to see his beloved wife with a high fever again. It scared her a little, but she wasn't offended at all by such affectionate treatment. Remembering the past, the Duke had already had to listen to the pleas of the impoverished Baron. The estate was in terrible condition, and not even his own servants trusted him. Seeing her father like that, Aisha looked at him with different eyes for the first time. At that moment, the man suddenly declared that he was willing to give her away as a concubine for a modest price. Upon hearing such offensive words, Michael advised him to be careful with his expressions. From a distance, the wounds on his body were almost invisible, although they were scattered all over his body. The girl begged him to help her family, because no one other than the Duke could do it. Once in the past, Michael swore to his mother that he would save the North and all its inhabitants. He perfectly understood the feelings of this girl, who only cares about her family. But looking at her, he wanted to change the terrible fate that had befallen her. That day, the Duke agreed to save her father, making a formal proposal to Aisha. Soon, rumors spread among the servants that the newlyweds hadn't even shared a bridal kiss. Michael diligently pretended not to hear all these conversations, although he knew perfectly well what it was about. At the moment the Duke offered his wife a small snack, he heard a rather strange response. Aisha simply asked to leave the room, apologizing for her brusqueness. Having immediately complied with the request, the young man understood that he would feel lonely even in married life. Every time he saw her in front of him, he wanted to rebuild his broken little world. Upon waking from her illness, the girl began to behave completely differently, as if she had become a completely different person. She really couldn't bear the cold, causing a bit of a commotion in front of the servants. Looking her straight in the eyes, Michael couldn't understand for a long time what was causing these changes. Everything changed the day she began to look him in the eyes with confidence. When Aisha was near, he would get anxious and remember the past. The Duke feared that that cheerful expression on her face would someday turn gloomy again. Having decided to straighten her hat a little, he felt that it was pleasant for him to show concern for her. However, Michael warned that soon they would have to start the return journey. At first, the Baron asked him to simply imitate the family, but he really got into the role. Recently, the estate seemed to have been transformed, although from the outside everything seemed the same. Aisha seemed to have crossed out her shared past, becoming a completely different person. A few days later, the maid said that the end of the festival was too boring. Her friend didn't agree with this and asked her not to say stupid things. The girls were delighted with the young woman's first public appearance. This debut became the most significant event that the whole North is now talking about. Knowing that the Duke held her hand every day, the young maids were absolutely delighted. They probably didn't understand very well that Aisha dreamed of reducing his overprotectiveness a little. The girl asked to be told the news that is currently happening in the capital. Upon not hearing any response, she felt a little uncomfortable due to the oppressive silence. Approaching, the maid told her about her uncle, who knows all the main news. He personally saw the prince leaving the palace, and they say he was an incredibly handsome man. He also genuinely cared about Mabel, although he wasn't her brother. To the surprise of the maids, Aisha had never seen the prince in person and only knew about him from rumors. The girl is sure that both dukes have completely different facial features, and their hair color is also very different. Davin took after his mother, who never had noble roots. Upon hearing these casual conversations with a smile, Aisha enjoyed the maid's frankness. After that, they asked for an answer, hoping to hear a romantic social story. Aisha understood that in her position, it was better not to say anything unnecessary. Otherwise, Michael would find out. Upon hearing the conversations, Michael decided to go out into the hallway and ask why they had gathered. While she continued talking happily with the maids, Aisha declared that Davin was no match for her husband. Looking at the maids, the young man advised them not to fill their heads with empty talk. The duke asked her if she really liked him much more than that archduke. Of course, there could only be one answer, and she confirmed his words once again. Michael asked her to only look at him if she didn't want to end up with a jealous husband. The next day, the duke called his assistant to his office and asked for a full report. The assistant was sure that Aisha had improved a lot, although she was very cold after the festival. In addition, she received an invitation from the south that the young man brought with him. This letter came from Archduke Davin's estate and was delivered by his messenger. In the letter, he spoke in such detail about the warm climate of the south, as if he wanted to lure Aisha to the south. After reading the invitation, Michael realized that that insolent individual was deliberately provoking him. Deciding to send a response instead of Aisha, the duke thanked him for the kind words about his wife. However, he apologized in advance for the refusal, attributing it to the girl's serious illness. His wife is now very ill, and despite a written invitation, she will not be able to leave the north. In his letter, Davin called her his old friend, whom he was obliged to take care of. Soon the girl received a personal invitation and happily told her husband about it. Michael was so busy with the correspondence that he completely forgot that the letter could fall personally into her hands. Now he had no other option but to leave for the south with her. He wanted to express his opinion to this cunning man as soon as he saw him in person. This time, a knight named Robert was in charge of personally escorting Aisha. He remembered that Chloe spoke of her constantly and had managed to miss her a lot. This man is the deputy commander of the guard, and it was he who blocked her exit during her escape. She still constantly remembers the threatening expression with which he looked at her. As he passed, Chloe asked if he could help her with her things instead of wasting time chatting. The girl really wanted to go beyond the north and understand what she really needed. Addressing Michael, she admitted that she felt uncomfortable just sitting around doing nothing. The duke still wanted to go with her, and he also had an important meeting ahead. Davin had been secretly communicating with him for a long time, and they clearly had something to discuss. The young man was determined to put him in his place because he was meddling in other people's affairs. Aisha originally wanted to sail on the ship, but now the curse of the ice witch had begun. The duke himself had hoped to take his wife for a ride on the ship, and now he was a little annoyed. He suggested stopping by the capital. It would be much better if we couldn't set sail. Aisha was happy with this offer because there would be many great cafes along the way. And of course, they will be able to spend time together. This will only strengthen their relationship. They say that in the establishments of the capital, they serve incredibly delicious delicacies. But one of the restaurants was special, and there were endless queues outside. Although she was in the north, her destiny as a time traveler had its clear advantages. Looking at his wife, the duke saw her so happy and cheerful for the first time. She has been trying to survive in the cold for too long, which is why she is acting a bit defiant now. After thinking for a moment, Aisha smiled and suggested that he stay home if he was too busy. In response, Michael asked her to name any wish if she had anything else. After a while, the carriage stopped, and the knight quickly approached the carriage. He offered to bring them something to refresh themselves while they made an emergency stop. At that moment, they were at the border, and it was much hotter here than at home. Upon seeing an unknown place, Aisha got a little scared, although there were guards nearby. But she understood that this shouldn't stop her or interfere with the implementation of the plan. Upon slowly exiting the carriage, she realized that it wasn't cold at all there, and that there was nothing to worry about. It was the first time the maid saw her on the street without warm clothing, as if she had stopped being afraid of the cold. Lara asked to be called immediately if the lady felt sick due to the cold. As usual, Varen was watching everyone from afar, afraid to get too close. From the cheerful face of the young woman, it was clearly visible that everything was really well with her. The maid begged her to at least put on a warm scarf, otherwise she would catch a cold again. Robert was also worried about the young woman and constantly asked about her condition. Lara was too restless and asked to make sure to tell Aisha if she felt cold. The Duke remembered that even during the cold season, very few people die from the frost. Southerners always exaggerate, because the north is really terrifying with its harsh climate. Upon noticing Baron in the distance, he called him and asked him what he was doing now. Approaching him a little closer, the girl was surprised that he didn't feel hot near the fire. After thinking about it for a moment, she remembered that that boy was from the south, like her. He spoke so little that it was hard to tell from his facial expression what he was thinking. He probably missed his homeland a lot, where many of his loved ones remained. The young man admitted that he almost has no memories associated with his homeland. Upon listening to this nice boy, Aisha couldn't understand how he had ended up in the north. Warming herself by the fire, she decided to simply listen in silence to the story of his life. Meanwhile, Chloe got some delicious food, offering everyone a small snack. With a smile on her face, she advised them to eat, even though they would soon be in the capital. After apologizing for the scarce food, the girl wished her mistress a good appetite. Aisha was glad that Chloe joined them, because that way it was much calmer. The only thing that wasn't clear was where all the other members of the Duke's crew had gone. Upon looking at the guards, she felt as if none of them cared about the cold. Aisha said with a smile that Chloe isn't affected by the cold either, and that she is a very hardened girl. In response, she affirmed that, as a personal knight, she was obliged to be strong and resilient. Upon approaching her, Chloe promised to always be on guard for the one whose life she was responsible for. At that moment, Aisha suggested that they take a short walk along the mountain path, if he didn't mind. Unlike the knights, she found it quite difficult to move through the mountainous terrain. She had already felt before the gentle touch of Michael's hands on her body. Her beloved husband gently stroked her hair, and her soul felt much warmer. Approaching him, the girl asked him to stroke her again, as he had done before. In response, the Duke warned that they had already reached the capital and that the trip would soon end. Upon arriving at the place, the girl immediately felt how much the temperature had changed. It was quite cold in the inn, but very soon they would enter a warm room. Upon receiving them at the threshold, Robert showed them the room reserved especially for Aisha. After thanking the knight, she asked which room Michael would be staying in. The knight was very surprised to learn that there was no separate room reserved for the Archduke. In other words, you will live together, as is appropriate for newlyweds. In response, Michael remembered that he hadn't given such an order, and that there had been some error. Gently hugging his wife, he offered to forgive the clumsy knight for this oversight. There was no other option than to live in a room with one bed. If you looked closely at his face, you could see that the Duke had orchestrated this himself. He was very happy when he realized that there really was a large bed. Thinking about this, Aisha couldn't understand why he did this and what he had planned this time. After all, they are no longer in the north and don't have to be holding hands all the time. Upon noticing her strange appearance, Michael asked her to explain what she was thinking. The girl decided to say it directly and asked why they were being placed in the same room. With a smile on his face, the Duke replied that it had been him who had given such an order. You can't say she didn't like it, but he didn't even deign to warn her. Aisha tried to push away the stupid thoughts that came to her head at this news. Leaving this question for another day, she decided to eat something after the long trip. As expected, the knights went straight to drinking and drank a glass of beer. The Duke, who knew his subjects well, ordered them not to get too drunk. Aisha was a little surprised because the knights behaved differently than during the trip. She was curious to know how the Duke would behave if he joined the general fun. Aisha always liked cheerful company and was happy to find herself in such a place. Upon realizing that the Duke had interpreted her words differently, she said she had meant something completely different. However, the knights also heard these words and invited her to join. Caught up in the general joy, the maid seemed to forget that her work hadn't finished yet. The fact that Aisha loved cheerful company didn't mean that she wanted to get drunk. She never imagined that the day would come when she would spend her time this way. What was happening started to seem like a dream to her, and the voices little by little merged into a single mass. Approaching, the Duke said in a low voice that she also liked that place. Upon hearing his words, she realized that it was better not to turn to him at that moment. If she sees Michael's face, she definitely won't be able to control her own desires. At that moment, Chloe noticed with horror that the lady had gotten too bored in their noisy company. To make everyone laugh, Robert decided to play a small game in which everyone had to say only the truth. The rules were quite fun, although it was a bit awkward to play in front of strangers. Judging by the expression on Michael's face, he always loved watching this game from the sidelines. Without wasting time, Robert spun the fork, waiting for it to stop. Upon realizing that she would have to tell the truth, the maid assured him that she wasn't worthy of accompanying her mistress. Furthermore, she always thought that Aisha's face looked somewhat like a cute rabbit. This confession took everyone by surprise, especially when Lara compared the lady to a rabbit. After that, they spun the fork several more times, but Michael remained out of the game. Finally, it was Baron's turn when the sharp side landed on him. Gustav was sure that such a brat would hardly have any interesting confessions for the mistress. After thinking about it for a while, the young man said that during the trip, an idea had occurred to him. Looking at his servant, Michael was very surprised that he spoke about Aisha. Robert decided to interrupt the boring talk and offered to fill everyone's glasses. Looking at this night, the girl understood that she simply had to tell him the truth. She stated that she wakes up in a cold sweat every time she dreams of his face. Without understanding what was happening, Robert asked to have explained to him what was wrong with his face. After that incident, she was left with psychological trauma because the fear was too strong. The knight continued listening to the confession with surprise, although he didn't understand what he had done wrong. Whatever it was, the Duke couldn't ignore it. One of the knights suggested interrupting them, but Chloe had terrible curiosity about how everything would end. She had a premonition of her own promotion. If Robert was removed from his position as head knight, she was in her element, and only thought about her own benefit. After a while, Aisha found herself in the room, completely forgetting who had brought her. The body was clean and smelled of soap, as if Chloe had intervened in it. Greeting her with a friendly smile, Michael said that she loved to drink too much, but he liked his wife even in that state, always remaining the same love. The girl was surprised because the Duke managed to sleep well, even after a short nap. During the war, he had to sleep standing up and with the sound of shells. Fortunately, in the pages of the novel there were no wars, which means everything remained in the past. She felt very sad thinking about the conditions in which the young Duke had to live. She decided to ask him at what age he started participating in real military campaigns. His first campaign took place at the age of 18, and he was one of the youngest fighters. However, he doesn't want to talk about this with his wife and prefers to choose another topic. Upon realizing that those memories hurt him, the girl apologized for the stupid question. Looking her straight in the eyes, he said that he could tell her something more. Michael agreed to tell his young wife absolutely everything that interested her. She was glad of such frankness and wanted to know what his mother was like. According to the Duke, his mother was a confident person and remained so even before her death. Later he realized that it was her control of the North that made her so strong. Although she didn't smile often, she loved to gently stroke her son's head. Upon hearing his story, Aisha was glad that he had so many good memories. Governing the North was quite difficult, which means that she really was a strong woman. Aisha remembered that the Duke himself handles this situation very well and that the Northerners like him a lot. Although at first he was a shy boy, he rejected all invitations. The girl was surprised that in the past, he had even rejected an invitation to the imperial palace. The Duke didn't consider himself obliged to appear in that place, since he had no relationship with the imperial family. After this, Southerners detested him for a long time upon realizing that he had isolated himself from outsiders. But now everything was fine, and he asked not to worry about the misunderstandings of the past. Recently, he realized that his friend was also unpleasant at the imperial palace. It is known that the reason for the tense relationships was a completely different motive. Davin became a nuisance to the crown prince and represented a threat by his mere existence. Although he tried not to show it, it was evident that he wasn't very happy with his situation. He has always been a kind and warm person, and it's unlikely that he would respond to evil with evil. Aisha understood perfectly that in reality, it was very difficult for him to live surrounded by enemies. Looking at the Duke straight in the eyes, she admitted that she saw a worthy man in him. He became the protector of the people of the North, just as his late mother wished. Tightly hugging his wife, Michael thanked her for her support and warm words. He was sure that he had made the right decision in taking her to the North and away from the palace. His confessions were quite frank, but Aisha understood the other side of the issue. The young man didn't receive any benefit and only acquired debts after the marriage. A second later, he suddenly realized that he had fallen asleep right in the middle of such a frank conversation. He continued to hold her hand, thinking that she still hadn't gotten used to the local climate. Deciding not to bother him, the girl also closed her eyes, feeling his warmth and tenderness. The next day, the weather was as sunny as during the festival. From early in the morning, Aisha had to listen to strange confessions from the servants. They claimed that the faces of the young people shone with happiness after a night together. The Duke preferred to act as if he weren't paying attention to all that talk. He understood perfectly well that he couldn't give any reason. Otherwise, the gossip would spread throughout the duchy. To everyone's surprise, he said that he had slept well thanks to his wife. Lara couldn't understand what Michael was implying, and if there was anything between them that night. The Duke reminded them, with a smile, that they were married, and that there was nothing shameful about it. Changing the subject, he suggested taking a walk to the city center and stopping at the place Aisha had asked about. It was a great idea, and the girl was already looking forward to embarking on another exciting trip. Unfortunately, it was at that moment that Robert came to tell me some not-so-pleasant news. According to what the coachman told him, there were serious problems with the carriage, and the trip might be cancelled. Upon seeing his reaction, the knight immediately offered to replace the carriage with any other. A little later, the coachman said he had discovered a crack in the carriage wheel. After listening to his report, Michael demanded to know why this had happened. He didn't believe the problem was due to poor wood quality and similar nonsense. After examining the wheel, he ordered the guys who had been on guard the previous day to be called. If you think about it, everything seemed really strange, as if someone had organized it on purpose. The guards appeared quickly at the Duke's order and assured that they were already aware of the problem. Just yesterday, this wheel was completely intact and there was no suspicion of breakage. Aisha remembered how they returned to the inn that morning before breakfast. This time would be enough to quickly ruin the wheel. After listening to his version, Michael confirmed that it's unlikely to be the work of children. The knight ordered that the wheel be repaired by the following night and promised to supervise the process. Judging by the look of the guys, they really won't leave the matter alone until the repairs are completed. Meanwhile, Michael ordered a reconnaissance detachment to be sent, and the knights had to go to Walter. This man was the captain of the Imperial Reconnaissance Detachment and knew everything in the area. Old Walter could fulfill any request if the Duke asked him personally. It's a pity that on such a wonderful day, he had to do routine things. However, thanks to this, Aisha found out that her husband had extensive connections in the capital of the empire. While thinking about it, she began to realize that they had shared the same battlefield together. Looking at Michael, she was surprised because he remained unusually calm. However, the Duke's mood changed quickly when it came to damage to his property. The carriage was damaged, and now they had to wait for the coachman to fix the problem. To not waste time, the young man suggested having a good breakfast and then going for a walk. This offer was very timely, because Aisha had the intention of offering the same. After a while, they were at the table having dinner, and the girl tried local delicacies for the first time. The taste was so wonderful that it was as if she had been invited to a heavenly tea party. Chloe suggested taking things easy, reminding them that they had plenty of time. For example, the Duke wasn't in any hurry, knowing that the best nights were nearby. After thanking them for the dessert, the girl asked if they had ordered too much food. There was so much on the table that they could barely eat it all in a small company. Meanwhile, Baron had no intention of stopping and continued to modestly eat his dessert. At that moment, the knight appeared with a report, saying that they had managed to find a witness. The Duke was so absorbed in his lunch that he decided to continue the interrogation a little later. Looking at his wife, he understood that her health was much more important than a broken wheel. The girl asked him to go alone while she would wait for him here. Chloe was ready to take command, as if she forgot that Robert was the head guard. Thanking her for her understanding, Michael decided to leave, promising to travel faster than the wind. While they were chatting, Baron had already managed to eat everything that was on the plate. At Aisha's request, the driver moved the carriage away from the house without unnecessarily attracting attention. A couple of hours later, when the Duke was supposed to return, he still wasn't there. With a smile on her face, the girl asked to go to the market since her husband was arriving a little late. Chloe has always loved places where she can observe the latest news more closely. While walking through the rows, Aisha noticed the bruise, which had very unusual colors. The seller claimed that his product had special properties and could cure heat and cold. Intrigued by such a strange product, the girl asked him to tell her more about it. She remained standing at that stall for a long time, as if she really needed medicine. Suddenly, Chloe heard a strange noise and turned sharply in the direction from where it came. She was almost sure that there was someone nearby who had been watching their walk for a long time. This statement surprised the girl a lot. She hadn't even suspected something like that. Having ordered little Baron to follow the lady, she promised to fix everything quickly. Ignoring the conversation, the seller offered to look at a sample. Upon seeing the small stem in his hand, the girl began to doubt its effectiveness. Suddenly, a hooded stranger appeared nearby and offered his help in choosing a medicine. There was no threat in his voice, and even so, this guy was acting in an excessively suspicious manner. Aisha severely demanded that they go their own way and not bother them with conversations. The young man admitted that he simply wanted to help the inexperienced girl. The seller kept insisting that his herbs were completely harmless, regardless of the customer's choice. In response, the stranger affirmed that he simply wanted to sell as many products as possible. Looking at the man, Aisha gradually began to doubt his sincerity. The seller tried to demonstrate that, even if there were any side effects, they weren't felt at all. If you believe his words, you simply have to respect the correct dosage when taking the medicine. The boy was seriously interested in knowing why Aisha needed these herbs. Upon observing the stranger more closely, the young man seemed to recognize someone in him. Unexpectedly, he affirmed that this medicine actually has a strong side effect. He warned her that as soon as she drank the decoction, her beautiful hair would fall out immediately. Upon hearing these words, the girl couldn't believe that such side effects existed. Turning to the seller, she reminded him that this was a very serious defect in the medicine. His product simply leaves people bald, and Aisha has no intention of being among those who end up bald. Wanting to know more about this, the girl turned sharply towards the stranger. To her surprise, the place was empty, although the young man had been there a second ago. Varen explained that he left almost immediately after a dispute began with the seller. Whoever he was, this man helped save her hair and didn't even hear words of gratitude. Meanwhile, Chloe kept her promise by catching those who organized the surveillance. Looking at the detained spies, Aisha couldn't understand under whose orders these people were working. There were two of them, and Chloe had chained them firmly with iron chains. At the same time, the Duke was approaching Walter's house, who had long been accustomed to living in isolation. Upon greeting the noble guest, the guards saluted the famous commander of the North. Michael was a little surprised by his fame, although he preferred to dispense with unnecessary formalities. As rookie officers, together with Walter, they played an important role during the war. The young man never thought that one day he would have the opportunity to visit that house. Although he was responsible for Chloe's care, he was still a little worried about his wife's safety. Greeting his old friend with a smile, Walter thanked him for his quick response to the invitation. He didn't want the imperial family to find out about their meeting, but promised to solve everything personally. Looking at him, Michael didn't understand why this meeting couldn't be avoided. In response, the man remembered that there simply were no other clues in the case, except for the only witness. This witness was a little girl with whom they were about to speak to him right now. The girl found herself accidentally behind the carriage, waiting for the bakery to open. Approaching the girl, Michael asked her whom she had seen near the carriage. In response, the girl just looked him in the eyes in silence, afraid to say the wrong word. A moment later, her expression suddenly changed, as if she saw something unusual. Upon noticing this, the guards whispered to the Duke to repeat it again. While he continued looking at the girl, he still didn't understand exactly what had attracted her attention. However, after putting on a sweet face, she transformed again and stopped being so reserved. She liked the Duke so much that she was willing to tell him everything she saw next to the carriage. While describing the criminal's appearance, Walter began to realize that many men had similar appearances. After listening to the description, Michael suddenly remembered a similar person. After meeting with the only witness, he decided to take a short walk down the street. The young man still wasn't sure, but it was evident that the criminal held a grudge against him. However, for the moment, there wasn't enough evidence to suspect anyone. An attacker would have needed at least 2 minutes to create the crack. This means that he knew in advance the night's schedule and the time when the guard change took place. Upon meeting the returning Duke, the knight reported that after dinner, his wife had fallen asleep. However, upon hearing his voice, Michael assumed that the guard wanted to say something more. Only now did he hear the news about the captured spies and the danger that pursued them. Upon hearing this, he got scared for his own thoughts and decided to find out everything immediately. A heavy stone weighed on his heart, because the Duke began to suspect that his own knights were treacherous. Upon receiving him at the threshold, Chloe greeted the returning Duke with a smile. She decided to start with the main thing, showing the same spies that they managed to capture. The girl said that while she was walking through the market, she accidentally noticed that someone was following her. The Duke understood perfectly well that the target wasn't Chloe, but the Archduchess. To ensure that no one bothered them, he rented the entire dining room specifically for the interrogation. But the Duke didn't want to wake Aisha, so he suggested moving to another place. He ordered them to be dragged to the basement, from where the spies' loud voices wouldn't be heard in the house. Following the master, the knight said that it was the first time he had seen such a strange form. He didn't know which unit they were from, since he himself was a retired soldier. Upon entering the room, the Duke immediately perceived the smell of blood that spread throughout the basement. Chloe personally beat the criminals as soon as she thought about their vile plan against the mistress. Addressing the Duke, she asked for the opportunity to describe the situation to him in full detail. Everything started at the moment they left the bakery and headed towards the market. The lady became interested in medicines, but Chloe immediately noticed that someone was following her from somewhere behind. Later, having caught them red-handed, she found tins of sleeping pills in the pocket of one of them. The young woman has already asked who they work for, but they remain stubbornly silent. She is almost sure that the guys themselves don't really understand what kind of dangerous situation the client has put them in. Looking at them, the Duke asked if these two knew his name and position. Upon realizing that they knew nothing, the Duke decided to say his real name. Upon hearing this, the knight realized how terrified the spies would be when they knew the name of the great Duke. All the knights of the North were strong not only physically, and could arouse fear with just one word. The young man had no doubt that after this, these two would be terrified. He wasn't wrong. The criminal really began to beg for mercy, asking them to spare his life. The spy began to tell how a group of gamblers from the capital had ordered His Highness to give them an order. First, they ordered him to bring an aristocrat from the south who owed a lot of money. It turned out that it was this aristocrat who gave the tip about Aisha, for whom they would pay much more. Upon realizing where all this was heading, Robert demanded to know how they had found out the whereabouts of the lady. One of the guys claimed that he had received a description of the girl's appearance in advance. The Duke grabbed the scoundrel forcefully and could barely contain his anger. He ordered them to answer honestly if they had anything to do with the broken carriage wheel. Upon remembering the client's last words, the spy realized that he should take the blame. Without even thinking about it, he affirmed that he himself had caused the crack a couple of days ago. This was the last straw, and the Duke ordered them to get rid of the two scoundrels. The spy tried to ask for forgiveness and promised to give him much more useful information, but no one listened to his words, and after his death scream, only a resounding echo remained. Meanwhile, in the south, the flowering season was beginning, and this time it was the most awaited of the year. It's a pity that this wonderful time is often overshadowed by palace intrigues. The palace has always been a place where there was a constant struggle for a place in the sun. Greeting the crown prince with a smile, Isabel wished him a wonderful day. The young man had long since been used to that kind of thing, although he didn't immediately recognize that woman. Only now, upon seeing Davin's mother, did he respond to the greeting with the same smile. Isabella was a little surprised, because Benjamin went out for a walk without an escort. The young man was sure that she would leave for the south as soon as she finished an urgent matter. Upon hearing his words, she realized that the crown prince was provoking her again. Without showing true emotions, the woman remembered that her heart would belong to the people of the south until the end of her days. In response, Benjamin expressed his regret because her son would miss his mother a lot. She believed that the crown prince would manage perfectly without Davin's help. The young man remembered the news that revolved around the baron's name. They say he had great achievements in the north after his daughter's marriage. From a very young age, he understood that it was necessary to establish strong ties in those circles. Wrapped up in the conversation, Benjamin realized that he should speak as little as possible about the past. This woman only cares about her own son, and the fate of the country doesn't interest her. Looking at the beautiful palace, he didn't want to see Isabella in that place. To calm down a little, he decided to go to his office, locking the door. At the same time, Aisha began to feel cold again, although it was quite hot outside. Remembering yesterday, she tried to understand why Chloe had acted so strangely. The girl demanded to know what happened to the people who were detained at the market. In response, Chloe simply affirmed that this could only be discovered after the Duke's arrival. Aisha couldn't sit and wait for the Archduke to arrive. In such a situation, she wanted to act, although she couldn't make decisions. And now, after having waited for her husband, she once again had to wait for him to wake up. It was a bit strange that Michael didn't go to train, as he usually did. She wanted to know many things, but she hadn't yet decided with which question to start the conversation. After a while, the Duke finally woke up, reminding them that they had caught the criminal. He was willing to tell me everything in detail, but first, he asked me to clarify something. Looking her straight in the eyes, the young man said that what happened wasn't her fault. Aisha began to suspect that right now, the whole truth about her father's meanness would be revealed. He not only sold his daughter, but also wanted to kidnap her to ask for a huge ransom. The Baron was always sure that his daughter belonged to him, like a little defenseless toy. After listening to her husband, she wanted to ask something about those two spies. The young woman wanted to hear the truth if the Duke killed them or spared their lives. A little later, Michael went to training and told his knight about the conversation. Robert still didn't understand what answer the Duke chose after hearing his lady's question. The Duke always assumed a thoughtful expression when disturbing thoughts tormented him. Robert advises not to get distressed, because people are always afraid when blood is spilled. After returning from the war, his girlfriend didn't even accept him, saying that the guy had gone completely crazy. But Aisha, on the contrary, thanked the Duke for making this sacrifice. In a distant past, she had already seen his hands in another person's blood. Then Michael also made a sacrifice, and he will never be able to forget his first fear. The young man often shut himself in, remembering over and over the moment of the murder. Then his late mother would break into his consciousness, carefully touching his hair. She reassured her beloved son, reminding him that he did it for his family. The Duke thought he would never hear again those words that Aisha repeated exactly. Upon observing his strange behavior, Robert began to feel a little worried. The Archduke of the North didn't seem like a madman, but he wasn't behaving completely normally either. His feelings for this girl are quite understandable, although there was a certain mystery in their relationship. Soon, Michael decided to have dinner alone, which was also quite unusual. He ordered the maids to take the food to his room, allowing his wife to be alone. Upon hearing these words, Robert asked if perhaps it would also be better to leave the Duke alone. The second knight asked to be told everything if Robert found out the details. After thinking about it for a while, Michael decided that there was some truth in this knight's words. However, Chloe didn't agree and suggested lightening the atmosphere a little. The young woman advised him not to complicate the situation and simply be closer to his wife. In response, the young man admitted that he was willing to do anything, as long as he always saw a smile on Aisha's face. Chloe was surprised to realize that the Duke hadn't given her any gifts lately. Every young woman should have some nice things, even if her husband gives her everything she needs. When they were first married, the Duke promised to fully support his wife. Then he went directly to her room and asked her what she wanted the most. But Aisha replied that she didn't need anything, and at that moment, she simply closed the door. Chloe didn't calm down and insisted on a nice gift before leaving for the north. Robert decided to support her. He was also quite surprised by the knight's indifference. Determined to give her the perfect gift, they set out to look for a suitable store. The knight began asking every passerby where the jewelry store was. The young woman replied that the Empress had summoned the merchants and that all the shops were closed. Just when hope was about to collapse, Chloe suddenly noticed something interesting. Upon turning around, the Duke saw in the distance the only shop that was still open. Without wasting time, he decided to head to that place immediately. This shop had everything you needed, and it was even strange that it remained open. They didn't know anything about jewelry and only looked enthusiastically at the gold necklaces. The stone of one of the necklaces was the size of a fist and fit Aisha's image perfectly. The Duke understood that the more luxurious the gift, the more his wife's feelings would ignite. Having chosen the prettiest one, he decided not to waste any more time choosing a gift. The seller immediately appreciated the young man's choice and promised him that his wife would be delighted. Michael handed him a bag of gold and allowed him to keep all the change. He asked how the seller managed to guess that the necklace would be given to his wife. The old man replied with a smile that at his age, people could understand even more. This made him wonder if all the residents of the capital were really that wise. Upon leaving, the knight felt a little hesitant, since such expensive jewelry shouldn't be sold on the streets. Chloe hurried to calm him down, asking him not to spoil her good mood. Meanwhile, a letter arrived at the academy that would surely interest a student. Arian didn't expect this, but they sent him a personal letter specifically addressed to him. Sebastian asked, surprised, why Archduke Davin was constantly sending him letters. In response, the young man said in a low voice that he had been taking care of his family for many years. Upon opening the envelope, he wanted to know the latest news of what was happening in the south. Benjamin even decided that the Duke was Arian's brother. However, the person Davin really cared about wasn't him at all. The news was quite unexpected, because in the letter, the Duke invited the young man to a flower festival. Benjamin remembered that every year his sister also drags the boy to this festival. While reading the lines, he began to understand that the Duke simply wanted to meet Aisha during the festival. A few days later, the Archduke received a reply letter from the Academy. Upon opening the envelope, he already knew that Arian was the author of that letter. The young man asked to leave everything on the table, promising to personally manage the paperwork. Seeing his happy face, Varun couldn't understand why he had changed so suddenly. It seemed like a normal letter, but it was this letter that completely changed the Duke's mood. Having decided not to argue with the knight, the young man asked to be called as soon as he needed help. With these words, he quietly left the office, leaving the Duke alone. By burdening the boy with extra work, Davin began to feel guilty. He always tried to be welcoming and friendly, but the work really increased. The farm workers also faced a heavier workload after the festival was postponed. But now, seeing all this confusion, he began to regret his idea. To distract himself a little, the Duke decided to read the letter and find out the latest news. Remembering what Aisha was like in the past, the young man was a little excited. At that time, she really wanted to go to the festival, but she couldn't visit such prestigious places. Her confused look was still before my eyes, but she only wanted to please her brother. That is why Davin decided to send an official invitation to Arian at the academy. The idea that they would attend a festival for the first time really enchanted the young man. Soon the day came when it was time to leave. Aisha had already gotten used to the adventures that began to happen too frequently. Michael wanted to calm her down a bit and told her that it wasn't her fault. In response, the girl stated with surprise that she had wanted to say something completely different. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard from behind. It was Walter, who had arrived running with his accusations. After apologizing for his excessive emotions, he explained that he simply didn't want to let them go without saying goodbye. As expected, the man officially introduced himself as the captain of the Royal Reconnaissance Detachment. Michael had already spoken about this gentleman, saying that he would fulfill any request. In response, the girl expressed her joy at meeting him and also introduced herself by name. She thanked the captain with a smile on her face because it was he who helped solve the case. Walter admitted that the Duke had felt very offended recently when he interrupted a meeting. This confession made her blush with shame because that day was a date for Michael. The man was sure that the Duke was now very different from that shy young man. Before leaving, he decided to tell an interesting story. At 18, the Duke was much rougher and crueler even with his comrades. But looking at him now, Walter seemed not to recognize that radiant young man. He acted so sweetly that it seemed you could play with him as if he were a small child. Upon returning from the mission, the knight reported that he was completely prepared to return home. The Duke's calm face showed that he was happy to meet old Walter. The young man warned that Aisha could sleep well during the long journey. Looking at him, she just wanted to forget that she wasn't the true owner of the body. After a while, they found themselves in a carriage, and the Duke suggested looking out the window. The view from the window was incredibly beautiful, as if they had entered a new world for a day. Her reaction was a bit unusual, because Aisha should know those places well. Only she knew the truth. She had actually visited that place for the first time. A rather strange feeling settled in her heart when she looked into his eyes again. Appearing at the window, Chloe suggested making a short stop and having dinner. Michael suggested taking a short walk while the servants prepared the food. Looking into the distance, the girl instantly froze in place upon seeing the golden sunset. In those moments, something special always happens, as if destiny itself had led her there. The very gift that had been prepared for that moment appears in the Duke's hands. Aisha had no idea that this unscheduled stop wasn't made by chance. This wonderful necklace reminded her a little of a young man's beautiful eyes. They were as red as the gemstone that adorned the gift. It was the first time in her life that the girl received something like that from a man's hands. After asking for her permission to help her, the Duke shyly placed the necklace on her delicate neck. Aisha felt her heart jump out of her chest, and her soul wanted to fly to the clouds. At that moment, the necklace suddenly broke and fell right to my feet. The girl was sure that she had pulled the chain too hard, breaking a link. The Duke realized that he shouldn't have bought gifts from a common street vendor. And ordinary. He insisted that this shouldn't have happened, given the high price of the jewelry. As a result, the necklace was ruined, as was the mood of both newlyweds. A little later, while they were walking through the forest, she kept thinking about what had happened. And even after a long time, when they got into the carriage, the expression on her face remained unchanged. With a smile on her face, the girl tried to calm him down by telling him that sometimes that happens. Michael only dreamed of meeting again with the merchant who had sold him the defective item. Aisha decided not to give up, to try to smile more and talk about something else. The Duke promised to buy several dozen necklaces at once, after checking them in advance. Looking at her sweet face, she declared that the desire to please was enough. A little later, she decided to ask why Michael had organized this little surprise. The young man didn't answer immediately, as if he himself didn't understand what had happened. Then he admitted that he just wanted to cheer her up, and that was the only reason. He was willing to do anything to always see a radiant smile on her face. After these words, Aisha wanted to fix the necklace that she had been given as soon as possible. Little by little, the number of buildings increased, which means they had almost reached their destination. The atmosphere was a little uncomfortable, as this little adventure could have ended better. Michael probably didn't like it either, although he did everything he could. The vast estate where they planned to stay belonged to Archduke Davin. At first, Michael was against it, but after much persuasion, he finally accepted. 10 minutes later, they finally arrived, and the coachman announced their arrival. Gallantly offering her his hand, the Duke asked her to descend carefully. Near the house, there was a guard posted, warned in advance of the arrival of important guests. Aisha was delighted with what she saw, because the ceremonial greeting took place late at night. After inviting the guests to the table, Davin invited them to feel at home. During a standard conversation, she didn't want to bring up the subject of her father. Davin was sure that life in the capital would remain in the young couple's memories for a long time. It was a little uncomfortable knowing that all these people had waited for them until late at night. At that moment, Michael decided to remind them that it was Davin who had begged them to stay at the estate. The young man didn't deny it, although he didn't expect to hear such a reproach. It was as if there was an invisible dispute between them, and Aisha had to listen to it in silence. She didn't want at all to be a witness to a hidden dispute between the two dukes. Turning to the side, she realized with surprise that Varen had a twin brother. Turning to Davin, she asked him why he was laughing at her reaction. It is clear that she confused the two young men, as would happen to anyone. Looking at the twins, she couldn't understand why they were scattered in different parts of the country. The young man remembered that in the capital, property rights belong to those who live there longer. Upon hearing this, Aisha decided to clarify why they decided to live apart. It turned out that one of the brothers wanted to stay in the south, while the other loved the north very much. That simple answer suddenly lifted her spirits, because she thought there had been a fight between them. After announcing that the guests' belongings had already been taken to their rooms, Davin suggested taking a short walk. He prepared large rooms for them and hoped the guests would have a good rest. The young man asked to respect the rules established on his estate. Now everyone was waiting for Aisha's decision, because they wanted to house them in separate rooms. And spacious. After thinking about it a little, the girl decided to accept and sleep alone for the first time in a long time. Once in her room, she was very surprised by the size of the bed. That same feeling of loneliness took hold of my soul, preventing me from relaxing. In the end, the sleep wasn't so pleasant, and she barely slept all night. The girl only managed to fall asleep at dawn, when the sounds of the house waking up began to be heard outside. Aisha firmly decided to pull herself together and spend the next night as she should. At that moment, the maid announced the Duke's arrival, who was already on the threshold. Judging by his face, the young man also slept very poorly without his wife. Aisha couldn't understand what was causing his tension and why he seemed empty. The Duke admitted that the room was so empty that he couldn't close his eyes for even a minute. Perhaps that moment with the failed gift became a turning point in their relationship. Now both cannot sleep peacefully when they are alone. After a while, the owner of the estate received them, happily greeting his dear guests. As usual, Davin was polite and suggested that they go directly to the central square. The flower festival was in full swing and was considered the most important festival for all residents. The aroma of the flowers spread from all directions, creating a wonderful atmosphere for the participants. It was easy to understand Michael's mixed feelings, since he knew why Davin had done what he did. People were very friendly to him, just like the inhabitants of the north who loved their duke. Upon noticing the guests who came from the south, the girl decided to give Aisha her beautiful crown. She asked to visit this place as often as possible, because Southerners are always happy to receive guests. Michael also received a beautiful crown, although this didn't affect his mood in any way. Upon coming to her senses, Aisha decided to remove that decoration and not behave like a little girl. Wherever they stepped, there was no place without the omnipresent aroma of flowers. There were flowers everywhere, as if they had entered a magical land. Previously, Davin didn't know that she liked flowers so much, and suggested that they visit the south more often. Upon hearing this, Michael remembered that in the north there is also a flower that Aisha likes. It's called Kilimanjaro, and it's a very resistant and unique flower. It was the first time Davin had heard the name of this strange flower, which was difficult to remember. Be that as it may, Northerners have no idea how interesting festivals are. The original story didn't have this scene, so Aisha didn't know how it would end. She decided not to get involved in this misunderstanding and not take on unnecessary problems. At the same time, Baron and his brother were waiting for more instructions. He just watched the festival from afar, looking out the office window. Upon noticing his thoughtfulness, Aaron decided to ask him if he wanted to go to the festival. This was their first meeting after the wedding, and Baron didn't think he would find him here. Continuing to admire the beauty of the party, he asked if Aaron had met the lady. The young man still hadn't managed to find her alone, although she had changed a lot since the north. Now Aisha looks completely different, as if she had become much bolder and happy. She was never the type of person who obsessed over titles and status. However, Baron was a little worried, wondering if he would ever be able to recognize the old Aisha in her. Meanwhile, Davin finds out about a kidnapping story planned by the Baron. He knew he was a treacherous man, but he didn't believe he was capable of kidnapping his own daughter. In response to all of Duke Davin's objections, he asked them to calm down, assuring them complete safety. As soon as the Baron sets foot on southern soil, he will be the first to know. The girl decided to support him, telling him that he shouldn't fill his head with other people's thoughts. After all, now is the time to relax and enjoy the vacation. Upon turning around, she accidentally saw Arian, who had also come to the festival. Davin admitted that it was he who asked the young man to arrive that day. To her surprise, he sent him a formal invitation, after having taken care of everything in advance. Looking at the girl, Davin advised her to spend the day with her brother. The news was quite unexpected, and Michael completely understood her feelings. The next day, Chloe decided to be the first to meet Aisha's younger brother. Introducing herself as the main bodyguard, she noticed his resemblance in appearance. If you look closely, they were indeed very similar in terms of hair color and red eyes. The young man was a little worried because his father could find out about this meeting. From his words, it became clear that Arian cared too much about his father's opinion. In response, the girl suggested not remembering him and just having a little fun. After all, this is their first festival together, and bad memories will ruin everything. Arian noticed that his sister's appetite had improved a lot compared to before. She always ate very little, and he advised her to eat a little more often. He was very happy that now his sister looked quite healthy and cheerful. Despite all the words, the young man's face was dejected, because he too had gone through difficult times. The girl said that he had grown a lot during this time, and that he looked nothing like his father. As expected, in response, he began to list the changes that had happened to Aisha. It was hard to imagine that one day they could attend a flower festival together. After giving him a beautiful crown, The girl asked him to always remain so wonderful. Arian thanked her for the gift and replied that he would do everything possible for the family. It was a great start, and he had no doubt that he would succeed. During the conversation, the girl decided to ask if Arian had met with the Archduke. Remembering their first meeting, the young man had doubts about this man. He looked at him with a strange smile and smiled mischievously. The girl rushed to reassure him, since Michael's facial expression and his intentions often don't match. After living with him for some time, she realized that he was a wonderful person. After spending the whole day talking, they didn't have time to realize that it was already dark outside. There wasn't even a shadow of displeasure on the young man's face toward studying at the academy. Trying to remember his face, she realized that she would be separated from her brother for a long time. Finally, Aisha decided to ask something, saying it in a strange way. She wanted to know his opinion on whether it was right to leave their own father like that. Upon not receiving an answer, she admitted that she would no longer sit idly by. The conversation was about their common father, so Aisha decided to talk about it openly. At that moment, she heard her brother's frank answer. He hated himself for his weakness, but now he understood that his sister no longer needed outside help. The young man was sure that his sister could do whatever she thought appropriate. When they said goodbye, Aisha asked him to send her a message if he needed anything. She believed that their meeting was not a coincidence, and that in the future they would remember that day with a smile. After saying goodbye to his sister, the young man thought for a long time about today's conversation. Standing in the same place, he understood that now everything would be fine with his beloved sister. He wanted to take a shortcut to get back home, but it was too dark to take it. While walking down the street, he had the constant feeling that someone was watching him constantly. Luckily, Arian had brought a knife with him just in case, since he had never been able to fight hand-to-hand. Turning around sharply, the young man demanded that the stranger say his name. The man's face was hard to see in the dark, but his features seemed familiar. He thought about what he would do if he turned out to be much stronger and armed. It turned out that Michael had been following him all this time and asked him to put down the knife. The last time they saw each other was at the wedding, so Arian didn't recognize him immediately. Upon realizing that he had made a mistake, the young man apologized for his insolence. At that late hour, only bars were open, but the young man wasn't allowed to enter such establishments. Michael suggested talking on the street if that were convenient. Some dangerous situations had occurred lately, so the young man decided to accompany him. But his wife seemed so happy that he just didn't want to interrupt their conversation. He clearly heard the words with which Aisha showered her husband with pleasant praise. Arian was a little surprised, thinking that their relationship wasn't so sincere. Addressing Michael, he asked him if it was true that he had been following them from the beginning. In response, the Duke decided to tell the truth. He had been watching them from afar for a long time. However, his sister had already returned home, and Arian couldn't understand why the Duke was still there. Instead of answering, the Duke handed him a small bag inside, which something jingled. Upon opening the bag, the young man saw many gold coins that now belonged to him. The Duke wanted to deliver this gift during the day, but didn't find the right moment. With a smile on his face, he suggested spending the money on his needs and not denying himself anything. The young man asked, surprised, why Michael was giving him that money and what he had done to deserve such a gift. The Duke didn't want to make up nonsense and decided to admit something honestly. He explained that the marriage to Aisha was contractual, so he didn't have the right to take care of Arian. But now everything is different, and the Duke no longer wants to leave the young man alone with his problems. They say that the Archduke lost his emotions after the war, but he was still capable of taking care of his loved ones. Only now did Arian begin to realize that the rumors about the Duke's cruelty were a lie. The young man kept insisting that with that act, he just wanted to help him. After thinking for a while, the young man asked if Michael had really fallen in love with his sister. Without wanting to hide the truth, the Duke replied that he loved Aisha more than anyone in this world. After returning home, Aisha spent some time looking for her husband all over the estate. Davin reported that the Duke was still absent, although he had promised to return a little earlier. Approaching the girl a little closer, he quietly told her the news related to her father. He was sure that Aisha would soon be able to meet the Baron in person to talk. It was known that this man hid in Baron Hilshen's mansion when they arrived in the south. The owner of the house was his father's closest friend and a known gambler among the aristocrats. Somewhat incredulous at this information, she asked who had reported it. Looking seriously into her eyes, Davin promised to help, even if the matter turned out to be dangerous. Aisha always tried to be merciful, but her father committed an act that was too low. However, she didn't want her loved ones to worry too much about it. She decided to accept help, realizing that very soon this story with her father would end forever. Meanwhile, the informants weren't wrong, and the Baron really lived in an old friend's mansion. He was determined to win it all and not leave that place until resolving the matter. His friend didn't even think that this man was capable of going so far. The man was horrified to learn how many people were hunting him at that moment. However, he wasn't used to losing and asked his friend how much money he had. Baron Hilschen reassured him by replying that everything was already prepared and that they could begin. After having searched the whole house, with difficulty he found 10 gold coins, but there was simply no more money. This news disturbed the man a little, as he was expecting a completely different amount. Knowing how difficult it was for his friend, Baron Hilschen agreed to lend him the money. After these words, he proposed going into the house and beginning today's game. Upon approaching the house, the man felt invaded by a strange feeling, as if the atmosphere had become hostile. Turning sharply to the side, he suddenly realized that his old friend was no longer there. Instead, 2 strangers appeared next to him and advised him to think about his own skin. The situation was too dangerous, but they invited me to the gaming table. Upon hearing the refusal, they quickly grabbed the man and dragged him inside the mansion. Upon waking up 10 minutes later, Ernest couldn't understand how he had ended up in that place. Everything before my eyes was very reminiscent of a normal prison cell. Now it was clear to him why this scoundrel agreed so easily to lend money. Calling out loudly to the guards, the man began to demand that they let him out of there. He threatened to kill them, reminding them that he was a noble aristocrat and had connections at the palace. However, instead of the guard, the man suddenly noticed his daughter's face in the distance. Approaching the cell, Aisha looked silently into the eyes of this lying man for a while. She asked him to calm down, because her own father insisted on the meeting, and there was nothing surprising about it. With a smile on his face, the man decided that his own daughter had come to his aid. Ernest demanded that they release him from there immediately, and that he was willing to forgive her for past grievances. There had been some misunderstandings between them before, but the Baron promised to forget about it. Instead of answering, the girl straightened up in silence, determined to confess something. She was almost sure that her father never felt sorry for his own daughter. In response, the man angrily declared that he had fed and raised her for 18 years. He demanded that she repay the debt and act as a loving daughter should. The girl reported that at this moment, they are in the largest prison in the Southern Territory. But tomorrow, they will lock him in a narrow room that he won't be able to bear, and they will force him to work. The girl has no intention of helping him and considers this punishment to be quite fair. Aisha advised him to be careful if they put some murderer in his place. Her father will soon feel how difficult it is to live in constant fear. Having said this, the girl turned around sharply, deciding to end the conversation. The Baron didn't give in and said that his daughter was no different from her late mother. She, who didn't want to hear such accusations, reminded them exactly who was to blame for what happened. All his life he wanted to appear as an influential aristocrat, but he remained a pathetic nobody. Having lost all his money and accumulated a ton of debt, the Baron ended up selling his own daughter. But now Aisha had changed and told the guard that she no longer wanted to see that man. The next morning, Davin invited the guests for tea and told them about the Baron's future fate. After listening to the report, Michael was a little dissatisfied with his constant slowness. Aisha remembered that, before she herself, would not have allowed her father to be imprisoned. But now, having learned his true nature, the girl didn't interfere in this. Once the main obstacle was overcome, her brother would be able to focus on his studies. At that moment, someone announced loudly the start of the annual competition. It turned out that after the flower festival, there was supposed to be a competition, which proceeded as scheduled. Davin reminded them with a smile that the competition existed and that they could participate. The news was quite interesting. Aisha had never participated in such events. There was no separate prize, but rumors circulated that the trophy brought good luck to its owner. Davin even heard that the atmosphere in the winner's family becomes much calmer. The girl proposed a fun rule. If there was a winner among them, the remaining 2 would fulfill any wish. She wasn't sure she would win, but she had experience working in a flower shop. Beautiful flowers were prepared in advance on each table. The girl decided to make a white background with many flowers and plant a red tulip in the middle. Even the meaning seemed excellent to her, and it stood out remarkably among the others. As expected, Davin chose yellow flowers. It was his favorite color. Looking at him, she realized that those flowers combined very well with his appearance. His expression was very sweet, which cannot be said of the stern Michael. Before starting the competition, she began to get nervous, wanting to take the victory for herself. Michael wasn't interested in this at all, but Davin was much more determined. After thanking the contest participants, the host was ready to announce the winner's name. At first, he wanted to name those participants who also won prizes. When the name of the contestant who took third place was announced, groans were heard in the crowd. To the surprise of many, second place went to Fabian Rabbit. This man worked as a gardener on Davin's estate and had very good skills. Unexpectedly, Michael heard his own name when the presenter announced the winner. Incredibly, the man who came from the north became the best of all the participants. Like everyone else, the Duke couldn't believe either that he had become the winner of the main prize. Looking at her husband with surprise, Aisha realized that he had never liked flowers. The presenter didn't expect such a result either, but advised treating it with understanding. The girl didn't want to argue at all. She was happy that her husband had won. The only strange thing is that the winner was someone who hates flowers and similar competitions. Some began to suspect collusion, as if Michael had bribed the presenter. Aisha was delighted with what happened, although she had some doubts about its veracity. Approaching the Duke, the presenter thanked him for his participation and congratulated him on his victory. In the entire history of the competition, no resident of the North has ever won. Immediately, flower petals began to fly around Michael, bathing each winner with them. It was probably the first time this had happened to him, and Aisha was happy to witness it. That same night, the Duke decided to do something that would please his wife. Holding the winner's cup in his hands, he offered Aisha the trophy for herself. In response, she remembered that the trophy should only be for one, since she didn't even get third place. Looking at Davin, the Duke expressed his main wish that he never come to the north. Aisha warned that the young man could have urgent matters in that part of the empire. Upon understanding this, Michael changed his decision and forbade him from coming to the north only for a year. In response, Davin promised to fulfill the winner's wish, but to go directly to the north the following year. After asking them not to fight, the girl suggested expressing his second wish. However, he decided to say it in person when there were no strangers nearby. He wanted to think about it a little before his wife heard his small wish. Upon hearing these words, Davin began to guess what it would be like. Aisha asked him to reveal the truth about how he managed to create such a beautiful composition. In response, the Duke admitted that he had performed the work with Aisha's image constantly in his mind. It is always nice to hear these types of statements, although it was terribly uncomfortable. At first, he wanted to respond with the same compliment, but then he abruptly changed his mind. Aisha knew very well that Davin didn't like hearing those types of conversations very much. Soon they arrived at the estate and decided to spend the night in one room. Today was the last day of the visit, and tomorrow they will leave these parts for a long time. She asked him if the heat was difficult to bear, and he replied that it was a little uncomfortable. Almost immediately after this, the young man fell asleep, too tired after the whole day. Looking at him, Aisha guessed what the problems were that prevented Michael from calming down. He came south only for her and deserves all her gratitude. Upon suddenly remembering their first meeting, the girl smiled involuntarily. At that moment, no one could know that one day they would travel and sleep in the same bed. Although the Duke had long since fallen asleep, the girl kept staring at the ceiling. She knew she needed to get some fresh air or she wouldn't be able to sleep. Since it wasn't as cold here as in the north, the air seemed much more pleasant. The moon shone with special intensity, as if it were calling Aisha somewhere in the distance. While she was lost in her thoughts, the owner of the estate suddenly appeared by her side. He advised not to expose herself to drafts so as not to catch a cold just before leaving. In response, Aisha remembered that she came from the north and that she wasn't afraid of the southern wind. She spoke in a rather amusing way, as if trying to show friendly concern. However, when he turned around, she saw an expression on his face that didn't contain even a shadow of joy. The Duke wanted to ask one last time, so as not to regret the words he hadn't said later. He wanted to know if she really intended to divorce her husband. The next day, all preparations were completed, and this was the answer to the Duke's question. Upon saying goodbye to the estate, she understood that she wouldn't see that place again in the near future. Thanking Davin for the welcome, she promised to reciprocate with the same hospitality when he arrived in the north. Having responded with a standard phrase, the young man simply turned in the other direction. Upon seeing him next to the carriage, Michael thanked him dryly for the service provided. Looking at her husband, Aisha asked him if he was upset because Davin had only said goodbye to her. Michael always considered him a vulgar person who knew how to ruin the atmosphere. Having said this, he turned around sharply, as if he didn't want to continue the conversation. Organization. They had a long trip ahead, since it was at least a 2-day trip to the border. Aisha wanted to end the relationship in a completely different way, and not see sadness in the young man's eyes. Suddenly, her head felt too empty when Davin began to disappear from her life. If you think about it, she had no reason to reject him, but many things have changed lately. Aisha had indeed planned to escape, but now she wasn't sure she wanted to do it. Before, breaking up with Michael seemed inevitable, which is why Davin was so sure of his decision. Only now did Aisha realize that she wanted to stay in his place forever. The girl wanted to be close to this man, who had sincere feelings for her. Upon noticing her thoughtfulness, Michael asked her to tell him about her relationship with Davin. After saying goodbye, her mood worsened, and this couldn't help but hurt his feelings. Upon hearing these words, she immediately remembered her brother's story about that same meeting with the Duke. Since he constantly frowns, even children begin to avoid him. The next day they arrived at the dock, where they planned to board a ship. Even in such a warm and sunny environment, the Duke's gaze remained cold. Suddenly, the girl realizes that her younger brother is arriving at the dock. He had been there since early in the morning and wanted to say a few words of farewell. Arian asked her not to worry about him and to do what her heart told her. The young man was willing to support any of her decisions, no matter how strange they might seem. Furthermore, he had confidence in the Archduke, who had now become his main support in life. This was perhaps the best farewell word a loving brother could give. While undercover, Michael said that his brother-in-law no longer felt uncomfortable communicating with him. This short trip brought him many benefits, although the Duke was very anxious to return home. Thanks to Aisha, he traveled for the first time throughout the empire and was enchanted with new discoveries. In response, the girl suggested that they rest a little when they reached the shore of their home. Just in case, she said that from now on they should only rest together. After all, they have been married for a long time and cannot live apart. Without wanting to argue, Aisha nodded to his words with a smile, understanding what he was implying. Meanwhile, on Davin's estate, the conversations didn't cease, and the maids began to worry seriously. The gentleman seemed to be ill, constantly locking himself in his office and not communicating with anyone. He couldn't forget that second in which he heard the true answer that destroyed all hope. In fact, the Duke asked this by accident, as if someone was pulling his tongue. However, her answer was really very important, and it was the girl's last day at the estate. At that moment, she honestly admitted that she no longer wanted to divorce Michael. In his eyes, she was no longer that docile girl who was always in the shadows. To have a little more solitude, the Duke asked with a smile to have some tea prepared for him. The image of Aisha was constantly before my eyes and made it difficult for me to concentrate on work. The young man understood that he needed to let her go and stop believing in miracles. But suddenly he ordered to send the hyacinths to the north, directly to Michael's property. It seemed that he could never overcome the loss, and that he wanted to meet Aisha again. 2 weeks later, they looked with surprise at the gift that had arrived from the south. Aisha decided that Davin wanted to make amends in this way because of the tense atmosphere of the last day. According to the gardener, these flowers will bloom in just a couple of months. To the girl's surprise, the Duke also sent a gift back to the south. He decided to give many seeds of the Kilimanjaro flower, known for its resistance to the cold. The package with the seeds arrived quite quickly, and the Duke of the South was a little alarmed. Upon receiving the gift, he understood perfectly what the Duke wanted to tell him. In his letter, he wrote that his wife liked it much more than Davin did. The words were quite amusing, as if he had started another ridiculous game. Meanwhile, Felix reminded the girl of the lesson planned for today. Michael asked her if she had liked the financial management lessons he had given her. Aisha was happy for something new and thanked her husband for his concern. The young butler sighed with relief when he finally left the office. He admitted that, when he saw the flowers in the north, he felt as if he were in another country. It would be better to have your own garden, because it's very difficult to grow flowers here. Felix said with a smile that the news of the flowers from the south had already spread throughout the duchy. This was something that happened frequently, since the servants always quickly passed the latest news to each other. And she knew well the key person who delivered them. At first the people here weren't interested in gardening, but now it has become popular. He never thought that everyone would start copying them when they learned to grow flowers. However, that same day something happened that tarnished everyone's joy a little. The lady sneezed only once, but the Duke immediately called the family doctor. Finally, Aisha realized that she had indeed gotten sick after arriving. The doctor apologized for his error, but he didn't know that the lady had already arrived. The poor doctor firmly resisted the Duke's pressure, although from the outside it looked funny. Under so much pressure, not all people are capable of continuing to work. Seeing that the situation was getting serious, Aisha asked loudly for everyone to calm down. She remembered that a cold doesn't disappear in 2 days, and the doctor cannot be blamed for it. If she took her medication regularly, the doctor promised her a full recovery. With a smile on her face, Aisha advised people to simply go train. And don't worry about anything. Since they returned from the south, the Duke had been pushing himself too hard. The girl just wanted to ask the jeweler about repairing the necklace. Upon hearing these words, the doctor advised her not to leave the estate during her illness. In addition, his younger brother was a jeweler and was famous for his talent. If Aisha was interested, he was willing to tell her everything he knew about his brother. His skills as a jeweler are recognized even in the capital, and he is often commissioned for important jobs. Upon realizing that this was her chance, the girl decided to trust him and meet him as soon as possible. After thanking the kind doctor, she asked him to convey an invitation to the estate to the master. Without wasting time, the man rushed to the exit, promising to fulfill her instructions. Aisha intended to do this in secret from her husband, quickly repairing the gift pendant, and then, on some significant day, appear before his eyes wearing this necklace. Some time later, Michael met an uninvited guest at the house. Upon seeing this, the girl was horrified and asked for the sword to be taken from the unarmed man. The Duke immediately recognized the same seller who had sold the defective necklace. At first, she wanted to avoid that meeting, as she thought her husband would return much later. But now it was clear that nothing in this house could be hidden from his eyes. Wanting to show how the expensive pendant had broken, he broke his own sword in half. Falling to his knees, the man began to ask for forgiveness, taking all the blame upon himself. It's hard to imagine what was happening in the heart of the poor doctor, who invited his brother to the estate. Looking at the seller, the girl demanded to know why he had deceived her husband. It's easy to understand that he simply wanted to deceive a rich buyer who doesn't understand jewelry. The man was forced to admit that difficult times had come for the family, and he took that measure. Even the doctor was shocked by the unworthy behavior of his brother, who became the laughingstock of everyone. The girl herself wanted to scold him, but the doctor decided to do it himself. Upon realizing that his wife still needed the master, the Duke allowed the scoundrel to stay in the house. Michael assumed that he simply wanted to fix the pendant, which had broken the first day. She was just looking for a good master and didn't know that the seller himself would appear. Throwing the necklace at the man, Aisha ordered the problem to be corrected. She wanted to get a piece of jewelry that couldn't be broken even by force. They say he was a very talented craftsman, so she trusted him fully. As for the punishment, Aisha decided to think about it later when she received the product. With these words, the girl wished him success in his work, hoping everything would turn out well. Just a week later, the flower sent by Michael was in full bloom. Davin couldn't believe it, because it normally takes longer to bloom. The guards had never encountered such a plant brought from the north. The Kilimanjaro flower became the subject of heated debate throughout the estate. It was like a real challenge that the Archduke of the North launched to the entire south. It turned out that in the north, there was also a beautiful flower that Aisha liked. Previously, Davin had no idea that this girl liked rare flowers so much. Michael may have sent the seeds with good intentions, but Davin was beginning to have his doubts. Upon entering his office, the servant informed him that many flowers had been sent to him, and that he couldn't throw them away. In response, Davin ordered that they be planted throughout the southern territory, since Aisha was in love with them. His intention was to sow the entire land with these flowers, making them the main treasure of the south. The servant was horrified to realize that the Duke had chosen the flower of the north for this purpose. There was still a slight smile on his face, but he was quite serious. The maids discussed this order for a long time, trying to get to the bottom of the truth. They remembered well the girl whose meeting had changed the Duke so much. The next time she comes to visit, Aisha should be delighted to see her favorite flowers. The young man supposed that the gift hadn't been sent by chance, and that Aisha herself wanted it. The flower was truly unique, and quickly began to fill the entire space. It was clear that only a convincing reason could drive such a measure. Mystically, the rumors about the flower dissipated instantly throughout the South. And after some time, growing flowers became the most popular activity. Who would have thought that between the South and the North, an exchange process would begin? And sale. Meanwhile, the initiators of all this were busy with their daily affairs. They didn't even realize how their little joke had turned into a big stir. Only once, when Aisha accidentally saw a financial report, she understood everything immediately. Upon learning of this, the crown prince became enraged and began to dislike her even more. This girl simply lives a normal life, but she creates problems for him every time. Frustrated, he threw the wine glass to the floor, unable to contain his pent-up anger. Benjamin was determined to stop this and not let the girl cross the forbidden line. Meanwhile, Aisha again disobeyed the Duke's orders by wandering around the house. As soon as he hears her cough, Michael immediately begins to worry a lot. Felix smiled as he recounted the last time she got sick after running away from home. However, when she got down to work, she realized that the regular expenses of the duchy were always the same. The accounting report was so big that it looked as if it had been stored for decades. Last year, around this time, there were large expenses associated with the banquet. The report listed the expenses for the Duke's birthday, and they were quite substantial. The girl was surprised to realize that the preparations for the party began much earlier. Usually, this type of event is supposed to be organized by the hostess of the house, and she began to guess what awaited her. It was a great opportunity to please Michael by creating an unforgettable vacation for him. He will surely appreciate her attitude if the girl manages to do everything right. The problem is that Aisha has never been involved in such organizations. The young butler remembered that the money spent last year hadn't been worth it. Many fewer people came than were invited, and the guest hall was almost empty. Upon hearing this, Aisha couldn't understand why the guests behaved so irresponsibly. It turned out that the Duke lost many of his friends due to his character. He saw no point in such banquets and preferred to spend the day alone. It was a shame to throw away the remaining food, so Felix distributed it among all those in need. The aristocrats expressed their protest because they didn't want to give expensive food to the commoners. After listening to the report, the girl decided to organize the banquet herself from now on. Upon entering the office, the Duke asked how much longer she would be working. Realizing that Aisha had gotten carried away with the banquet, he asked her not to do anything special on an ordinary day. Michael will be very happy with just a greeting if it comes from his wife. The words sounded very touching, but the girl was determined to carry them out. When she decided to start with the invitation letters, she was a little surprised by a strange fact. Not a single invitation letter had arrived at the Duke's estate lately. That's why she decided to be the first to invite noble aristocrats to her house. Seeing her efforts, the young man felt a little sorry that his wife had only recently appeared in his life. He knew everyone on the list, but warned that relations had always been tense. Aisha wanted to know everything related to her husband's name and his friendship with other families. Lost in his thoughts, Michael suddenly realized that he knew almost nothing about the local ladies. Surprisingly, he didn't know many girls who lived in the north. Realizing that he had said too much, the Duke decided to go to morning training. It seems he said something wrong, otherwise the atmosphere wouldn't have changed so abruptly. At his age, Michael still knew nothing about the women who surrounded him everywhere. Until that day, he had never thought about it and decided not to waste time on nonsense. Seeing his confused look, Baron decided to offer him help if necessary. The young man had been watching Michael for a long time without daring to address him directly. Looking at the Duke, he suddenly said that the gentleman's ears had suddenly turned red. Baron had already delivered the medicine to the doctor, having fulfilled his master's morning order. Michael was glad to get along with Aisha and stated that they seemed like the same person. After apologizing for his abruptness, the young man decided to continue working and fulfill the butler's order. He remembered well the night the Duke asked him if he had an older sister. Michael always considered him an orphan, thinking that the boy never had a family of his own. Then Baron told him about his brother, who had lived in the south of the empire for a long time. Sometimes, when he is near Aisha, he seems to remember fragments of the past, and sometimes it seems to him as if he really had an older sister. Meanwhile, the answer to the Duke was different, and the young man stated that his sister had died many years ago. After a while, Michael met his wife in a very special outfit. Today, she was dressed much lighter than usual, as if she wasn't afraid of the cold of the north. He was a little alarmed to realize that the sudden change could make her lose consciousness. The Duke understood her desire to become a northerner, but still ordered the cloak to be brought here. Looking at her husband with surprise, she began to guess the reason for this behavior, but she didn't want to argue and preferred to simply trust Michael. Aisha was increasingly convinced that deep down, her husband was a warm person. Approaching a little closer, he announced the arrival of Baron Valencia's wife. Michael advised her to start with her if she wanted to establish good relations with the aristocrats. Aisha wanted to remember this name, offering her friendship in the future. Shortly after, the guests met the main couple of today's event. The banquet was magnificently prepared, although some guests were a little surprised. The hall was full of aristocrats of various ages, and Aisha occupied the most honorable place. First of all, she decided to simply go out where the guests were and show them the rules of good manners. After thanking them for their time, the girl announced the start of the gala banquet.